Right here, this is the actual edition that John Scopes used in the classroom and that the biology teacher used. And in this book it says, if we follow the early history of man upon the earth, we find that at first he must have been little better than one of the lower animals. At the present time there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of men, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America.
And that's 1925. That's not that long ago, 80 years ago or so.
Right, and that was endorsed by many liberal Christian groups, by the American Civil Liberties Union, who initiated the whole trial, and that passed for science back then.
And so we could see in that the justification in the minds of the Europeans for the colonization of the world, that they felt an entitlement to pillage Africa and to steal from India and so forth.
Now, there's the old-fashioned view, race does exist because it's biological. So that's called by some people racial naturalism. But the position that most people in critical race theory have is race does exist, but its existence is not a biological existence, it's a socio-political existence. And from this perspective, the reality of race is basically a reality that is socially created. It's not an intrinsic reality in the nature of the human race, that there are these sort of natural demarcators, these sort of natural lines of division among the family of humans. Rather, these lines are artificially drawn by human beings, and the argument is they're drawn in response to particular political projects. So the idea is that race then becomes a system, and if we ask a person, what is your race? What we're really asking is, where are you located with respect to the system? It's not a question of what the person's natural biology, what their natural genetic makeup is. That's not really the question. What we're really asking is, how are you located in the system? And the system varies. So you can move from one country to another, and you can assume a different race. The system evolves over time. So if you racially categorize one way at a particular time, you could go back 100 years and find you racially categorized a different way. But we should not infer from this that race is therefore unreal. That's a mistaken inference. Race is constructed, therefore it's unreal. It's not a conclusion that follows. Race is constructed, but it's very real. It's very real because being categorized a certain way, being identified as having a certain race, then slots you into a particular position in this racial system. And the extreme example, of course, the clear-cut example is apartheid South Africa. You're categorized as black, you're categorized as colored, you're categorized as white. This is going to have an immense influence on your opportunities, on your life chances, on where you can go, on whom you can marry, on all these things. And as such, it's likely to have an effect on your consciousness also. So the social reality of race should not at all be taken to imply that it's not something that matters. It matters hugely. But we need to locate the proper metaphysics of it. And the proper metaphysics I'm arguing is a social metaphysics, a social ontology, rather than a natural, biological ontology.
Race is a social concept, it's not a scientific one. Even though it was attributed to scientists early on, like people like Linnaeus trying to define different races and different species. It's impossible to talk about race without using racist terminology and classification terminology. At least I haven't worked out how to do that.
And the whole idea that there are different races of people have come into rather serious criticism. And if you think about it, most of racism was really based just on skin color.
Yeah.
Maybe some other small features, thickness of the amount of fat in the eyelids and what have you, and the shape of the eye, and some small differences in skeletal shape, but primarily it's color.
And those terms are used in a pejorative way usually to describe the red man and the black man and the yellow man and so forth. Mm-hmm. So talk about skin color to us, would you?
Well, the intriguing thing is, I hate to break the news on this, but there are no white men.
Is that right?
Yeah. For example, you might think I'm a white man. Let me show you what the difference is right here, Don. This is white, and this is me. If I were this color, you could be pretty confident I would have been dead for at least a few hours. So, really, if we have very little pigment in our skin, the blood shows through. We're kind of a pink color, but most of us have at least some pigment. And I think that's something we need to discuss. And if I might just go up to our
Please do.
magic chalkboard.
Show us what you got, my friend.
These are some of the different colors, so-called, that we claim to see. As we look at humans, they basically range from a very light color to the darker color. But it's really all one color. We're talking about differences in shade. And those differences in shade are due to a special protein made in our skin, or a family of proteins called the melanins. These are pigments that tend to be brown, black, and in a special form of melanin can be sort of red. We call that pheomelanin. Let's look at what these pigment cells look like. You know, when we're in the womb yet as a developing fetus, at first we really have no pigment. The pigment cells begin along the midline of the back in an area called the neural crest. And at about 3 to 4 months of development in the womb, these cells migrate out into the skin, take up residence there, and start to produce this pigment called melanin. And these pigment granules leave the pigment cells that make them and enter the cells of the epidermis. Here we're looking at the deep surface of the epidermis. That's the surface layer of the skin. And the arrows are pointing to 3 of the pigment cells. We call them melanocytes. And next to these cells, here and here and here, all along, are cells of the epidermis that have a brown pigment in them. But they have picked up this pigment secondarily from the melanocyte. So the pigment leaves the melanocyte and goes into these cells. Why does the pigment go there? It's a sunscreen. It protects us from the damaging effects of the sun hitting our skin. People who lack pigment, such as albinos, are extremely vulnerable to sun irradiation. Can develop basal cell carcinoma, other cancers of the skin. Whereas people with very dark skin are almost immune to basal cell carcinoma. Let's look at what these pigment cells look like up close. In this photograph, we've taken a picture that kind of shows more detail of the pigment cell. And here's one right here. And if you look carefully, it looks like sort of a spider. It has long processes, and the pigment granules are produced and go out into these processes. We'll show you a kind of a blow-up of that area in a cartoon. Here is the pigment cell right here. And you can see the long processes going out. And what will happen is that the other cells in the epidermis will just sort of bite the ends of those processes off, taking the pigment into the interior of the cells of the epidermis. Now, when that occurs, one of the most remarkable things, I think, in the skin is that these granules, on arriving in the epidermal cells, which make the dead layer of our skin eventually, the granules are shuttled into a position to form a perfect little umbrella over the top of the nucleus. Here are the granules here. If I outline them, they're right here. And you'll notice that forms a cap.
Yes.
The sun comes from down here, and it hits that little umbrella, and the umbrella protects the DNA, the genetic material of the dividing cells in the epidermis. Without this, we would suffer tremendous genetic damage
from the
to
sun.
the cell. Yes, from the sun.
Uh-huh.
And let's see what that actually looks like in life. This is a picture taken through the electron microscope. Right in the middle here, there's a very high magnification, thousands and thousands of times. Right here in the middle is the nucleus that contains that special genetic material necessary to make that dead layer to protect us from drying out and what have you. And over the top you see many of these dark granules. This is the collection of melanin, and it forms just a beautiful umbrella. And this pigment is designed to absorb ultraviolet light precisely in the wavelengths that are the most damaging to the DNA of the epidermis. Interesting thing is, if we didn't have this kind of protection, we'd get even more genetic damage than we do. But as it is, every day of our life, even sitting under the floodlights in this room, we are getting genetic damage to our DNA and our epidermis. But as this damage occurs, there are special enzymes that identify it, snip it out like a little scissors, make a proper patch, and splice the patch in to repair the damaged DNA. Every living organism known, from bacteria to man, has this DNA repair mechanism, and it's been estimated that if they didn't have it, no life would survive.
Dr. Menton, you're amazing. What you tell us about the human body is amazing as well. So we know not only that we have this special pigment in our skin, and we know what it's there for, that it's a protectant for the nuclei of the cells there. And it's like a little umbrella to protect from the sun, to keep us from having genetic damage. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. And when genetic damage does occur, which is inevitable, we have a backup system that snips out the bad pieces of DNA, makes a proper corrected patch, and splices it in. This is actually gene splicing, but it's God's gene splicing going on right inside the cell.